My name is Sabrina Monroe. I came home after years of classified missions, no medals, no parades, just silence. At my sister's engagement party, I stood alone. No one asked where I'd been. No one cared. They erased me from the military legacy wall like I was a mistake they wanted to forget. Then he walked in. Full dress uniform. The room fell silent as he saluted me and said, "Ma'am." "SEAL Commander." That moment. It shattered everything they thought they knew about me. And that was just the beginning. I didn't expect a welcome home party, but I also didn't expect nothing. No porch light left on. No welcome back sign taped to the door like when Emily came back from her officer's course. Not even a folded blanket on the couch. The house looked like it had been expecting someone but not me. The taxi pulled away, gravel crunching under tired wheels, and I just stood there on the curb with a suitcase in one hand and silence in the other. The Monroe house looked exactly the same. Same hedges Dad always trimmed like it was a competition with the neighbors. Same wind chime by the porch that used to tinkle like laughter every time my siblings and I slammed the screen door running inside. Only now it sounded like an echo in a house I no longer belonged to. I stood there a moment too long, hoping maybe someone had noticed. That someone was peeking through the blinds or walking down the hall and saying, "Is that Sabrina?" But no blinds moved. No door opened. Not even the dog barked. That's when I realized I hadn't just been forgotten, I'd been written out. When I finally let myself step inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and freshly baked ham. Warm, familiar, but none of it for me. "Mom," I called out, voice softer than I remembered it ever being. She passed by the kitchen threshold carrying a tray of deviled eggs, heels clicking pearls in place. She didn't flinch. "Oh, you made it," she said. No hug. No smile. No. "How was your flight?" Just a glance. Then back to balancing appetizers. That was the moment I realized even my name didn't land the way it used to. In the dining room, a crowd gathered around Emily. She looked every bit the perfect daughter, pristine in her crisp army dress uniform, hair pinned flawlessly, her smile practiced but warm enough to pass for real. She was introducing her fiancé, Captain Marcus Hall, as if she were unveiling a national monument. "Army intelligence," she said, glowing. "Real officer stuff." Mom beamed like she'd just won a medal too. "Marcus was just promoted," she added quickly to the group, loud enough for me to hear. "Not like those who used to serve or whatever." I didn't correct her. I didn't remind her I'd served longer, deeper, in ways they couldn't imagine. Because that would have felt like begging. And I promised myself I wouldn't beg to be seen. I lingered on the edge of the living room near the mantel with all the family photos. My eyes scanned the wall instinctively. Emily in uniform. Blake, our youngest, with a grin, half covered in desert dust, his first deployment photo. Mom and Dad back in their Navy days. Even the dog had a Christmas picture framed. Nothing of me, not one school photo. Not my high school graduation. No boot camp snapshot. Like I'd never existed in this family at all. The ache was sharp and strange. Not new but deeper somehow, like a wound I'd stopped checking until now. I used to think I left to find myself. But maybe I left because I already knew they didn't want to find me. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen island. Alone. Emily's laughter carried through the walls, rising like steam from the dining room. No one offered me a seat at the table. Instead, I balanced a paper plate on my knee next to a cousin I didn't recognize, someone who asked if I still did the traveling yoga thing. I smiled. Nodded. No one asked what I'd done. No one asked who I'd saved. No one wondered what it took for me to come back alive. I chewed in silence, letting the cold ham settle in my throat like shame. The kind of shame that isn't yours but sticks anyway. At one point, I heard Dad laugh. Deep, full. The way he used to when we'd camp out in the backyard and he'd tell Navy stories under the stars. He hadn't laughed like that for me in years. He passed behind me once, caught my eye, and said, "Didn't think we'd see you again." Not cruel. Just distant. Like I was an old neighbor stopping by to borrow something I'd lost. He didn't ask where I'd been. No one did. By the time the engagement party reached full volume, I had mastered the art of being invisible. No one asked me to toast. No one asked if I'd flown in from somewhere. I could have been the hired help for all they noticed. I stood near the back patio door sipping flat ginger ale pretending I wasn't tracking every glance that slid right past me. Emily glowed at the center of it all. My little sister, confident, magnetic, wrapped in the admiration of family and military guests alike. She wore her dress whites like armor polished to perfection. The gold insignia on her chest caught every beam of afternoon sunlight while the rest of us dimmed in her shadow. I used to tuck her into bed. I used to shield her from bullies in middle school and sneak her extra desserts when Mom said no. But here now she didn't even glance in my direction. When someone asked about me just within earshot, she tilted her head and said with a small chuckle, "Oh, Sabrina, she used to serve. Doesn't anymore. Does something overseas like health consulting or..." Yoga laughter followed. Polite. Controlled. I didn't flinch, but inside the truth pressed against my chest like a scream I wouldn't let out. Used to serve. As if that chapter had closed gently, like I'd wandered off into something soft and simple. As if I hadn't walked through fire zones. As if I hadn't carried wounded men twice my size through smoke and metal and blood. As if I hadn't whispered last rites into radio silence more times than I could count. I wasn't looking for a parade. I just hadn't expected to be erased. Someone handed me a napkin with cocktail shrimp. I nodded, then sat again at the fold-out table in the corner right beneath the humming air vent next to a 6-year-old cousin licking barbecue sauce off her sleeve. The kids' table. For adults. I tried to laugh at the absurdity of it. Me. A decorated operator, well, technically not decorated since our operations didn't exist on paper, but still. 15 years of service. And here I was balancing a soda can between my knees like a civilian who didn't even get invited on purpose. From my seat, I had a perfect view of the family's wall of honor just beyond the archway. Dad's Navy medals. Emily's ROTC leadership plaques. Blake's deployment photo taken the day he shipped out. Even a photo of Mom from her medic days back when she used to call herself the battlefield's Florence Nightingale. But no Sabrina. Not a single frame. Not even a dusty Polaroid from my boot camp days. As if I had evaporated before their pride could reach me. It wasn't just forgetting. It was intentional. A slow deletion of anything that didn't fit the narrative of the perfect military family. My name had become inconvenient, easier to misremember than explain. The microphone squeaked at the front of the room, drawing everyone's attention. Emily stood with Marcus at her side, both radiant under the event lights. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," she said, voice clear and confident. "My family's legacy and service has meant everything to me. My father led with courage, my mother healed with heart. My brother is stepping into duty with purpose. And I'm proud to carry that torch." The applause came fast. Enthusiastic. My ears rang from the hollowness of it. Not once had she mentioned me. I looked down, tracing my finger along the condensation on my soda can. I counted the seconds. 7, 8, 9. Just long enough to push it down. Then the front door creaked, and something in the room shifted. A tall man entered wearing full dress uniform, dark blue ribbons aligned like poetry on his chest, presence crisp and undeniable. He looked older than most in the room, early 50s maybe. Weathered but steady. He moved with command in every step. People whispered. Guests straightened in their seats. Emily froze mid-sentence. He scanned the room, searching until his eyes found me. He stopped. For a moment, he just stared. Like he was seeing a ghost he'd sworn never to speak of again. Then he took one step forward, raised his hand, and delivered a precise, deliberate salute. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm but commanding. "SEAL Commander." The room went silent. Utter bone-deep silence. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else gasped. Emily's face turned to stone. My mother's wine glass trembled in her hand. Dad blinked as if he was trying to compute a language he hadn't spoken in years. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just held his gaze quiet and still, as if we were back in that Syrian village under sniper fire, communicating without words. The man, Colonel Alan Pierce, if I remembered correctly, lowered his salute slowly, then gave me a small nod. One only ghosts understood. One only survivors could return. And then without a word he took a seat near the back. Like he hadn't just detonated a truth bomb in the middle of a celebration built on forgetting. The ceremony tried to limp forward. Emily rushed through the rest of her speech, voice, two tight hands visibly shaking. She didn't look at me again. The applause afterward was polite. Smaller, less sure. I sat still, the room swirling around me, and thought maybe being invisible wasn't the worst thing. Maybe being seen, truly seen, was the most dangerous feeling of all. That night I couldn't sleep. The hotel mattress was too stiff, the AC too loud, and my mind refused to quiet. I kept replaying that moment over and over, his voice, that salute, the hush that fell like a curtain across the room. Colonel Pierce hadn't seen me in over a decade, and still he remembered. Not my face. Not my name. My rank. That was the thing about Black Ops. No one was supposed to remember. But the ones who did, they never forgot. I powered on the hardened laptop I'd kept buried in a false-bottom duffel, something I'd carried through more borders than I could count. The encryption still held. My hands moved instinctively across the keys, muscle memory from another life. One blinking message waited, flag unauthorized archive access, Storm Echo, internal scrub alert activated. My chest tightened. Storm Echo. We never called it that in the field. We didn't call it anything. The mission had no name, no patch, no record beyond whispers and wounds. 6 women, no official rank, no country, just a directive and a death ratio. I clicked the log. Accessed from Military Academic Network, IP user clearance limited, bypass detected via historical credential patch. I stared at the screen. Number. It couldn't be. There was only one person in that house who had access to the Military Academic Network. Only one person recently commissioned. Only one person writing her senior thesis on gendered narratives in modern combat doctrine. Emily. I closed the lid so fast the room seemed to shudder with me. My pulse was a drumbeat in my neck. I'd wanted her to see me. To recognize my worth, my service. But not like this. Not by stumbling into a system she didn't understand. Not by brushing against a file that was never supposed to be opened again. Not by holding a match near a powder keg. My phone buzzed. A text from Emily. Hey. Can we talk? On the porch. Just us. Of course she wanted to talk now. She stood barefoot under the porch light, wearing an oversized hoodie that made her look 15 again. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her face held none of the polish from earlier. Just nervous energy and something softer, remorse maybe. I didn't know it would trigger anything she said before I even closed the door behind me. I swear, Sabrina. It was just for research. For your paper, I asked, voice low. On women in combat, she nodded, eyes wide. There was the system link from the Defense Archive Index. It wasn't labeled. Just opened when I searched cross-gender engagement strategies. It said, Storm Echo, scrubbed, and I clicked. You shouldn't have. I know that now, she whispered. My stomach turned. She had no idea what she'd done. That folder wasn't just redacted, it was buried. Scrubbed under layers of denial built to disappear if even skimmed too hard. A shadow script had been embedded in that archive. A dead man's switch. One that notified every surviving member of the team if access occurred. Not for protection. For containment. I looked at her, really looked at her. The girl everyone called golden. The one who had a clear path through service, celebration, a wedding in spring, and yet she had walked accidentally into a world she wasn't prepared for. A world I had lived in and barely escaped. You don't understand, I said quietly. That file. It's not just data, it's names. Faces. Actions no one ever wanted on record. I didn't share it. I didn't download anything. Her voice cracked. I didn't even know what it was until I saw the words, Special Operator Monroe. And I froze. I sat down on the steps, the wood cool beneath my legs. You think the worst part of being forgotten is that no one remembers. But sometimes, It's that no one was ever supposed to. She sat beside me, barefoot, silent, small again. I just wanted to tell the truth, she said. And there it was. The same fire that had once lit inside me. The belief that truth could heal, could honor, could restore. But the truth mishandled could also kill. You wanted to write about forgotten women, I said softer now. But do you even know whose name you just dragged back into the light? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I thought, if I wrote about women like you, about what you've done, they'd listen. They'd care. I laughed. It wasn't cruel. Just tired. The world doesn't listen until it needs something to clean up. Until it wants a story that makes it feel better about what it ignored. She looked down. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know. And that was the worst part. I believed her. She didn't mean harm. She was just proud. Just curious. Just careless. Back at the hotel, I pulled up the alert again. Checked the breach report, the metadata, the flags. The access had triggered the old code tree. And that meant something else too. Someone else had noticed. Someone beyond me. Which meant Storm Echo wasn't just at risk of being remembered, it was at risk of being erased for good. Storm Echo wasn't supposed to exist. Not on paper. Not in memory. Not even in the stories we told ourselves to survive. It was the kind of operation you agreed to, knowing it would leave no trace, not even of you. There were 6 of us. We didn't wear rank. We didn't wear names. Just black patches on black uniforms stitched by hands we'd never meet, signed off by commanders who'd never admit we existed. I was the oldest, 29. The rest were younger. Recruited for different reasons. Different pasts. All carrying ghosts of their own. There was Hayes the sniper with a poet's eyes. She once wrote a letter to her mother before every mission, never mailed, just folded inside her boots. There was Vega, our comms lead, fiery fast, and always the first to break the tension with a bad joke. She danced before every insertion. Said it kept her human. Maritza, the quiet one. Combat medic. Small hands steady even when blood flowed like water. She never said where she came from. Only that she had no one waiting. Ramsey was muscle, born with steel in her spine. Could bench press half our gear. But I saw her cry once watching a dog limp across a blown-out street. And then there was Lee. Youngest, newest. She died on day 3. Storm Echo dropped us into northern Syria, just beyond the Turkish buffer zone, where no one claimed ownership but everyone claimed violence. Our directive was clear: dismantle a covert finance cell fueling multiple insurgent groups. Take out infrastructure, take out command, leave no flag, no symbol, no trace. 12 days. 12 days without extraction. Without resupply. Without guarantees. We moved through ruins like ghosts. Slept in half-buried shelters. Ate rations meant for half a week. Tracked encrypted bank transfers off a salvaged laptop while dodging drones and sniper fire. On day 3, Lee tripped a mine outside the compound wall. I still remember the sound. Not the explosion. The silence after. The kind that makes your body forget how to breathe. We buried her in the sand behind an old school. No marker. Just a stone shaped like a crescent. Vega pressed her dog tags into my hand. If we make it out, she said, you make sure someone knows she was real. I still have them. On day 7, we held a bombed-out medical station for 18 hours straight while downloading a database from a cartel-linked financier. Maritza took a bullet to the thigh. Ramsey held the line with a broken arm. Hayes didn't sleep for 3 days. I watched us dissolve from soldiers into specters. Not because we broke, because no one was watching. No one waiting. No one coming. That was the thing about Black Ops: they promised you glory through disappearance. But they never told you how much it would hurt to be forgotten. By day 11, we were crawling through a sewer tunnel beneath a mosque, tracking one final signal: our jackpot. A drive hidden in a locker used to launder millions into active combat zones. It was there. And so was the militia commander protecting it. We didn't get all of them out. Vega was wounded in the chest. Ramsey dragged her 2 blocks under open fire. We got the drive. but no one said thank you. When we were finally extracted, no one met us. No one saluted, no one offered coffee or medals or a flight home. Just a classified debrief in a basement room under a clinic in Jordan. And then silence. They sealed the records. Filed us under non-operational. Said it was too politically volatile. Said recognizing the mission would raise questions. About gender integration. About protocol. About what it meant when women succeeded where men had failed. So they buried it. And us. I didn't talk about Storm Echo for 10 years. Didn't say Hayes' name out loud. Didn't tell anyone about Lee's folded letters. Didn't explain why I still flinched at the smell of blood mixed with dust. When people asked, I said I used to serve. Because how do you explain a war no one believes happened? How do you tell someone you gave up your name for a country that never bothered to remember it? Back at the hotel, I sat on the floor in the dark. The laptop blinked again. Another ping. Another alert. Someone was still accessing fragments. I opened the trace path. Scrubbed names. Dates. And then coordinates. Burial sites. Someone was trying to erase even the ghost trail. I reached into my bag and pulled out the old photo. The only one we ever took. Grainy. Taken on a cracked satellite phone. 6 women. Standing in a rubble field. Smiling. Not because we won. But because we survived. We were never supposed to be remembered, but I remembered. And that would have to be enough. I thought silence was our protection. Turns out it made us easier to rewrite. 3 days after Emily accessed the Storm Echo archive, a summary report appeared on a closed-door congressional oversight docket. It wasn't raw data. It wasn't even the partial brief we were sometimes told might one day be declassified. It was propaganda. Packaged neatly in a 72-page document titled Case Study Operational Instability in Gender-Integrated Special Forces Missions. I stared at the cover on my screen, bile rising in my throat. Inside were cherry-picked log entries, vague timelines, reorganized events that no longer resembled truth. The story it told that Storm Echo was a cautionary tale. That the mission had failed due to interpersonal friction, emotional volatility, and non-standard leadership dynamics. No names. Of course not. Just implications. Just enough to bury us a second time, this time under shame. At the top of the digital chain, Senator Mark Ledlow. I remembered him. Everyone in D.C. did. A career hawk with a southern drawl and a handshake like a grip test. He built his reputation opposing expanded combat roles for women, voted against every integration bill since 2001. Now he had a perfect weapon, a leaked file no one was supposed to touch, and a narrative he could twist to prove his point. Storm Echo wasn't just being forgotten, it was being weaponized. And my name, my real one, was hanging by a thread in the metadata. I called Emily. She didn't answer the first 3 times. When she finally picked up, her voice was raw. Tired. Did you see it? She asked. She didn't need to say what it was. I saw, I said quietly. I didn't mean she started, but stopped. They're saying the breach was tied to me. That I violated Article 92. Unauthorized access to sensitive material. My commander put me on administrative review. I closed my eyes. It wasn't her fault. Not entirely, but she'd lit the fuse. I wanted to show the world what you did, she whispered. I thought if I told the story, your story, people would finally see you. They don't want to see me, Emily, I said. They want to erase me and use your mistake to prove I should never have existed in the first place. Later that night, my father called. Your mother's worried sick, he said. No greeting, no pause. She saw the news, Sabrina. She saw Emily's name tied to some top-secret gender mess. You dragged her into this. I laughed cold and sharp. I dragged her. Or did she stumble in trying to write a tribute to people you've never once acknowledged? Don't twist this, he snapped. You embarrassed this family once already when you disappeared, now she's paying for it too. I didn't respond. I just let the silence sit there. Thick, heavy. Because what could I say that he hadn't already decided wasn't true? To them, I was always the unstable one. The unpredictable one. The one who left who didn't go the traditional route. Who vanished into classified fog instead of walking across a graduation stage in uniform. And now that the truth was knocking on their front door, they blamed the echo. Not the silence that came before it. Back on my laptop, I traced the origin of the case study. Its metadata pointed to a sanitized server cluster in the Capitol complex. But the underlying version, the one scraped together in fragments, had digital fingerprints, embedded keywords, out-of-order time codes, and one sentence that made my blood go cold: recommended. Full record elimination of all Storm Echo documentation. Risk level PR volatility tier 1. They weren't just writing a cautionary tale, they were preparing a purge. I opened the old external drive. The one I kept wrapped in duct tape and stashed inside the hollowed-out spine of a fake travel guide. It held the truth. The real after-action reports. Helmet cam footage. Unedited comm logs from all 12 days. And something else. The only full mission debrief that ever used my name: Commander Monroe. Unit status: 4 survivors. Extraction complete. Operational integrity preserved. That sentence was the only official recognition I had. A single line in a buried file that no one wanted to see. Now they were trying to erase even that. And this wasn't about glory anymore. This was about survival. If they rewrote Storm Echo as a failure, everything we did, all the lives we saved, all the choices we made in the dark would be twisted into evidence that we never should have been there to begin with. That women don't belong in command. That emotion equals incompetence. That ghosts like us deserve to be forgotten. I wouldn't let that happen. Not to Lee. Not to Hayes. Not to any of them. So I powered on my encrypted rig, bypassed 3 dead clearance levels, and pulled up the last firewall I swore I'd never open again. The war wasn't over. It just changed format. The message came at 2:14 a.m. No subject line. No sender name. Just coordinates, a timestamp, and an activation code I hadn't seen in over a decade. Nightshade initiated priority. Tier 1 SEAL command required directive infiltration plus elimination. Target: Crimson Dawn. I stared at the screen like it had summoned a version of me I wasn't sure still existed. Nightshade wasn't just a mission. It was a final call. Crimson Dawn had been surfacing in fragmented chatter for months, an emerging paramilitary network operating in collapsed regions of Yemen and Eastern Africa. Unclaimed but coordinated. Weaponized through black market channels. U.S. intelligence believed they were planning synchronized suicide bombings on 3 bases in the next 30 days. This wasn't theory, it was countdown. And someone had decided I was still useful enough to lead. Fort Sentinel looked the same as it had in the early 2000s, rows of sterile concrete buildings painted in Patriot gray, humid air thick with the scent of oil and sand. I walked into the ops center wearing a plain gray field jacket. No stripes, no insignia. Let them guess who I was. They didn't stand when I entered. I didn't expect them to. The room was filled with officers 10 years younger than me, fresh off textbook training and simulations that had never drawn blood. Some looked confused. Others skeptical. And then there was him. Colonel Warren Holt. Seated at the far end of the strategy table, arms folded, face unreadable. I hadn't seen him since the last classified Senate briefing I'd sat through, one where he'd referred to Storm Echo as a social experiment disguised as strategy. And now he was the senior advisor to Nightshade. Of course, after the intel briefing concluded, I was handed a sealed file labeled Operational Command Confirmation. C. Monroe. No room for debate. The moment I broke the seal, Holt stood. "Excuse me," he said, voice dry. I was under the impression Lieutenant Vance would be leading this mission. Everyone turned. Vance Young, decorated, standing 2 seats to my left, stiffened. "Lieutenant Vance is the infiltration lead," I said calmly. "I'm commanding this operation." Holt smirked. "You have no official record of command in the past 10 years. "I have scars deeper than any file," I replied. He didn't speak. Just sat back down like a man who knew where to place the knives when the lights went off. Later that night, I reviewed the roster. 20 operatives, mixed gender, cross-specialized. But the unit didn't trust me, not yet. You could feel it in the drills, shoulders turned just slightly away. Glances exchanged when I gave orders. Vance didn't hide his skepticism. At one point he cornered me outside the strategy tent. "I don't take orders from legends," he said. "Especially ones whose records are blacked out." I met his gaze. "Then don't think of me as a legend. Think of me as the one who'll get you home." He scoffed. "Or buried." And there it was. The thing every woman in leadership hears, even if it's never said aloud: "I'm just waiting for you to fail so I can say I knew it." Back in my quarters, I logged into the secure server. I still had my skeleton key access. A privilege from another life. What I found made my spine go cold. Holt had authored a preliminary risk analysis about Nightshade just 3 days prior. In it, he suggested that prior command candidates with unstable field histories posed a significant liability to mission cohesion. He never used my name. But he didn't need to. The memo ended with recommendation: if assigned, allow failure to self-validate case precedent. In short, let her crash, then use it to prove we were right all along. The next morning, I walked into the war room and laid out my revised infiltration plan: tight timing, 3 fallback zones, recon on all frequency blind spots. No one interrupted, even Vance didn't argue. It wasn't because they trusted me, it was because the plan was airtight. But I saw the way Holt watched me from the back of the room, calculating, waiting for something, anything to crack. Let them watch. Let them wait. I wasn't here for applause. I was here to finish what Storm Echo started. We landed under a gray sky. No fanfare, no formal send-off. Just the heavy churn of rotors' boots crunching on dusty rock and the quiet weight of what waited ahead. Al-Mazrah wasn't marked on any civilian maps. Just a rumor tucked between border zones and fallen checkpoints. But intelligence suggested Crimson Dawn had converted it into a logistics hub, a place where encrypted comms, bomb, relay systems, and high-value data moved like blood through veins. We had 72 hours to shut it down. No civilians. No noise. In and out before the world noticed. The plan was simple, too simple. We split into 3 teams. Vance led infiltration. His unit was tasked with disabling comms nodes and scrambling jamming signals. Mason ran rearguard with a sweep and secure team. I led the northern breach, our entry point, our fallback line. Everything was clocked down to the second. 7 exit routes. 3 drone corridors. An evac window every 42 minutes. But none of it mattered. Because the map was a lie. It happened fast. Static flared in my headset. Then a garbled voice. "Ambush west sector, repeat enemy positions." These alleys weren't on the grid. I froze. The alleys. We had scrubbed every satellite pass. Run thermal overlays. Triple-checked field drone sweeps. Those alleys didn't exist on the intel. Unless someone doctored the maps. I dropped to one knee, heart hammering. Pulled up the master overlay. And there it was. A full corridor, twisting, narrow, sharp-angled, had been stitched into the rendering post-clearance. A deliberate blind spot. Someone had rerouted us into a trap. Vance's voice came through again, sharp and short. "We're boxed in, 3 down, no mobility. Need extraction in under 8 or we're not making it." 8 minutes. I didn't hesitate, didn't radio for permission, didn't consult the chain of command. I rerouted half of my unit, split our cover teams, and issued false traffic on enemy frequencies, luring attention away from the breach point. Then I ran. Straight into the trap. Smoke filled the air as I reached the west corridor, narrow walls coated in soot, shouts ricocheting off stone. I saw Vance pinned behind a fallen column, 2 of his men trying to drag a third whose leg was slick with blood. They weren't going to make it. "Cover right," I shouted, tossing a smoke round. I hauled Vance over my shoulder as if we'd trained together for years. His weight was dead-centered, heavy but familiar. He didn't speak. Didn't fight me. Hayes laid down cover fire with jammed knuckles and a rifle that barely held together. It didn't matter. We pushed through. 1 inch at a time. And then we saw it. A concrete hatch half buried behind a burnt-out generator. Alvarez, my intel lead, flagged it with a nod. We blew it open and found what Crimson Dawn had been hiding. Not just command. Not just servers. but a live bomb, linked to 3 GSM pulses, each one connected to a US outpost. A ticking detonation sequence sat like a glowing heart in the middle of the room. 15 minutes. Alvarez stepped back. "This is familiar," he said quietly. I stepped closer. The wiring pattern. The trigger module. The power redundancy system. I'd seen it before. Syria. Storm Echo. Same architecture, same timing loop, same kill radius. Whoever built this had studied our past, or had access to it. "Don't touch it," Mason warned. "I'm not," I said. "I'm killing it." I entered the chamber alone. Dust hung thick in the air. My boots scraped against wire-lace stone. 12:47. 12:46. I reached the control node, pried open the casing with my knife, and started tracing the override paths. My breath was slow, measured. I remembered Lee's last smile, Hayes' bleeding hands, Vega's voice cracking over an open channel. I remembered what silence cost us. And I remembered that silence doesn't save anyone. I cut the first wire. The system screamed. Then blinked red. Then black. When I stepped out, the room was dead quiet. Vance sat propped against the wall, bandaged and pale. He stood slowly, painfully, and saluted with his uninjured arm. "Commander," he said. His voice didn't shake. "I'm sorry I doubted you." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Back at the makeshift base, I stared at the disarmed trigger coils of red wire curled in my palm. Same pattern. Same bomb. Same war. Storm Echo wasn't history anymore. It was here, alive. And someone was still trying to use it. The Pentagon briefing room smelled like cold marble and disinfectant. Everything in that building was designed to look like certainty: brushed steel, sharp corners, spotless walls. Like, if the floor was clean enough, they could pretend no blood had ever soaked into it. But blood lived in the cracks. I knew that better than anyone. They seated me at the center table. A single chair. No rank. No stripes. Just me. Across from me, a panel of officers, civilian contractors, and congressional aides, each holding copies of a file I'd spent the last week unburying. Nightshade debrief report, supplemental evidence by Commander Monroe. The room was too quiet. Someone cleared their throat. "Commander Monroe," a woman began. Her voice was polite, polished. "You're here today to clarify inconsistencies in the mission execution of Operation Nightshade and to address unauthorized re-entry into suppressed systems tied to Storm Echo. In other words, defend your name. Defend your past. Defend your right to have existed at all." I looked down at the drive in my hand. I'd brought everything: helmet cam footage, comms, logs, mission overlays. But none of it would matter if they had already decided what story to tell. So I didn't give them a speech, I gave them the truth. I was given maps that had been altered. I pulled up the satellite data on the screen. This is the version my team trained on. No alleyways in Sector 6. Now here I flip to the extracted version. We see the same region with new architecture. Added post-clearance. I clicked again. Here's the access log from the defense server. IP traced to a terminal registered to Deputy Commander Warren Holt. Gasps didn't echo, but they rippled. Shoulders stiffened, heads turned slightly. Holt didn't move. Didn't blink. But I saw it. The calculation behind his silence. He was waiting to discredit me. He didn't have to wait long, because that's when the door opened. And Emily walked in. She wasn't in uniform. No ribbons. No pressed collar. Just a black blazer, a simple blouse, and a badge that said Specialist Signal Encryption clipped to her chest. She walked to the witness stand like the ground owed her balance. For a moment she looked across the room and locked eyes with me. I couldn't read her expression. I didn't try. "My name is Emily Monroe," she began. "I'm a junior officer in training, specializing in military GOT security and archival integrity. And I'm the one who accidentally accessed the Storm Echo archive 2 weeks ago." Someone scribbled notes. Others leaned in. I didn't know what I was opening, she continued, voice steady. But once I saw what it was, I didn't back away. I kept reading. Because it was the first time I'd seen the truth about someone I thought I knew. She looked at me then. and didn't look away. I used to think my sister disappeared because she couldn't handle the pressure, that she walked away from the family, from duty, from honor. But I was wrong. She didn't walk away. She was pushed out of the frame so everyone else could feel comfortable. Silence. Real, raw, breath-holding silence. She held up a flash drive. This contains the log records of the false map injection before Nightshade. I decrypted the trail and traced it back to the override codes. The pattern matches Colonel Holt's digital credentials. Now Holt moved. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "She's not even qualified. She's emotional. She's trying to protect." But he didn't finish. Because the presiding commissioner, a woman with ice-gray hair and a voice like verdicts, interrupted him. "We've reviewed the submitted data, Colonel, and corroborated the digital fingerprint. Please step back." Holt clenched his jaw, then sat down. Emily turned back to the room. "She's not a myth," she said. "She's not a story built by trauma or politics. She's a commander. She led teams who shouldn't have made it out and brought them home anyway." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "And I let her carry all of that alone for too long. I didn't cry. Not then. But something shifted inside me, something I hadn't let move in years. It wasn't relief. It was recognition. From the one person I had stopped hoping would ever offer it." Later, as the hearing adjourned, the panel announced a formal investigation into Holt's manipulation of field intel and long-term bias in command assignments. He was escorted out, not in cuffs, but close enough. As for me, I was cleared. Not just of suspicion, but of silence. They handed me a reinstatement letter. My record, once scrubbed, was now sealed as distinguished black-level service. And for the first time, someone official looked me in the eye and said, "Thank you for your service, Commander Monroe." But the words that stayed with me came later. In the hallway, where Emily reached for my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Not for the file, for not seeing you." I squeezed her fingers. "You see me now," I said. And that was enough. They called me in just after sunrise. The defense secretary's office was quieter than I expected. No press, no ceremony. Just a long windowless hallway and a polished wooden door that swallowed sound like a vault. A young aide with sharp eyes and a name tag that read M. Patel led me inside. "They're ready for you, ma'am." He said it with practiced respect. Not the kind you're told to give, but the kind that's earned after reading something you never thought was real. The Secretary of Defense stood as I entered. Not protocol. Not show. He just stood. Tall, silver-haired face lined by decades of wars he never fought but sent others to survive. "Commander Monroe," he said, extending his hand. "We let a hero live in the shadows far too long." I didn't say anything at first. The word hero felt strange in the air, like a jacket borrowed from someone else. Too big. Too stiff. But not unfamiliar. "I didn't do it for recognition," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." He handed me a folder. Not digital. Real, paper. Wait. Inside, a reinstatement of full honors. Black-level commendations reclassified under SEAL Program Echo Red, service record restored. Codename retired. And at the top, name Sabrina Monroe, status active, retired, Tier 1 clearance preserved. For the first time in 15 years, my name was no longer hidden beneath clearance codes and silent acknowledgments. I existed again. On record. On paper. In history. They offered me a medal. I declined. Not because I wasn't proud, but because there was no ribbon wide enough to carry what we had done. What we had lost. What we had given up to come home whole or close enough to pretend. Instead, I asked for something else. A plaque. Quiet. Simple. Installed in a place only a few would ever see. 6 names, no ranks. Just first initials and the phrase, "They moved unseen but not forgotten." After the meeting, I stepped outside. The sun hit hard against the granite steps of the building. A few reporters loitered across the plaza trying to guess which hallway would leak a headline. I passed them like fog. My story wasn't theirs to print. Later, I sat alone in the park 2 blocks from the Pentagon. There was a fountain there I used to walk by in uniform. Before the missions. Before Storm Echo. When I still believed that service was about ceremony. I pulled the folded photo from my coat pocket, the grainy one from Syria. 6 shadows in the rubble smiling like they'd won something. And maybe we had. Maybe surviving was enough. My phone buzzed. A message from Emily. They're writing about you now, not Storm Echo. You. Wanna read it? I stared at the screen for a long time. Then typed number. I already know how the story goes. Because the truth wasn't in the press release or the polished tributes. It was in the silence I'd lived through. And the voice I chose to reclaim. Recognition had come too late to save some of us. But it came. And that mattered. It couldn't undo the pain, but it could anchor the healing. Because when someone says your name out loud, your real name, after years of calling you a ghost, something inside you finally exhales. Something buried comes home. And you realize you weren't waiting for them to believe you. You were waiting to believe yourself again. The folding chairs still squeaked. The floorboards still groaned. The air inside the Jacksonville Community Hall still smelled like old wood, Lysol, and memories. It had been 20 years since I last stood inside this building, back when I was just another teenager in a denim jacket doodling on the back of a church bulletin, dreaming of the day someone would say I mattered. I'd spent a lifetime proving I did. But no one said it. Not until now. Emily stood at the podium. No rank on her collar. No medals on her chest. Just her voice, clear, steady, and more honest than I'd ever heard it. I want to begin by telling you about the sibling I never understood, she said. Not because she was distant or strange or broken, but because I never asked. She scanned the room, packed. Standing room only. Veterans in their Sunday best, young girls in ROTC uniforms, churchgoers clutching folded programs. And my mother sitting in the front row with her hands clasped so tightly they turned white. My sister didn't disappear. Emily continued. She didn't walk away from her family or her duty or her identity. She simply wasn't allowed to exist. There was no music. No slideshow. No military salute. Just the sound of someone telling the truth. For years, she said, we filled our walls with medals and framed photos, pictures of the people we thought embodied courage. Her voice caught. But I've learned that the most powerful people in a family are sometimes the ones left out of the frame. The projector screen behind her lit up. One photo. Unfiltered, grainy. Pulled from body cam footage maybe. A woman, helmet off, eyes locked ahead, dust in her teeth, sun cutting across her brow like a line between memory and myth. No name underneath. Just one sentence. Not every hero is in the frame. Some are the frame itself. The audience didn't clap yet. They didn't breathe. They just felt. And when I finally saw what she had done, Emily said softer, now I realized something else. She looked out at them and, for the first time, looked back at me. She never tried to be inspirational. She didn't need hashtags or headlines. She didn't say watch me or follow me. She just did the work. She lived the kind of courage that doesn't need to be announced. A long pause. And that's what real inspiration is. She stepped back from the podium. No dramatic music. No gesture for applause. The room remained quiet. Expectant. I took one step onto the stage. Then another. Not in uniform. Just jeans, a gray shirt, and an old coil of disarmed bomb wire in my hand, red and frayed at the ends like a heartbeat that refused to stop ticking. The applause didn't burst. It built quietly at first, then stronger, then all at once. Not for glamour. For truth. I didn't give a speech. Not right away. I stood under the light and let the stillness wrap around me like armor that finally fit. This wasn't about vindication, or revenge, or even pride. It was about recognition, late yes. But still healing. That's when the girl walked forward. 8, maybe 9. Tiny shoulders, oversized sweatshirt. Holding a purple flower bent at the stem, petals smudged from being gripped too tightly. She didn't speak. Just offered it up. I knelt to meet her eyes. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I want to grow up like you, she said. Brave, but quiet. My breath caught. It wasn't the kind of statement that made headlines. But it was the kind that changes a life. I took the flower, touched her hand gently. You don't need to speak loud, I told her. You just need to stand where it matters. She smiled a tiny, crooked, impossibly sincere thing and ran back to her father, who wore dog tags under his open flannel collar. I turned toward the crowd. My sister spoke of frames, I said, voice low but clear. Of who gets placed in them. And who gets cropped out. I used to think the worst thing was being forgotten. But I was wrong. The worst thing is living like your story doesn't matter. I lived in silence not because I was ashamed, but because I thought the only way to serve was to disappear. I looked at my parents. My mother wiped her eyes. My father sat still, jaw tight, hand on his heart. But silence doesn't save anyone. Not them. And not you. And maybe the reason I'm standing here at all is because someone finally decided to stop cropping people out. I stepped back, letting the applause rise again, not louder, but truer. Because they weren't clapping for a war story. They were clapping for something more radical: presence. A woman who showed up anyway. Who didn't wait for permission to matter. Who did the work quietly until the world was ready to listen. And when the ceremony ended, I saw it. The new wall in the hallway of the center. A gallery of portraits of women who served uniforms and nursing caps, tool belts, and hard hats. But one frame stood empty. No name. Just a caption etched in brass. For the ones who led without asking to be seen. I'd stood in front of death more times than I could count. But this was different. The microphone stood quiet, waiting. The kind of quiet that wasn't absence but expectation. Like it knew too much had gone unsaid for too long. And for once the silence wasn't mine to carry alone. It was time. My name is Sabrina Monroe, I said. And for most of my life I've been a ghost. I let the words hang. They called it service. They called it classified. They called it for the good of the country. But what it really was silence. A few heads nodded. Some people leaned in. I didn't need to raise my voice. I've spent 15 years following orders that can't be confirmed, fighting wars that can't be acknowledged, and walking back into houses where no one asked where I'd been. I paused. Let the words breathe. People talk about what it's like to be forgotten. But let me tell you something, the deepest kind of pain isn't being forgotten. It's being invisible to the people who claim to love you. A hush settled over the room. You could feel it, not discomfort, but recognition. I sat across dinner tables with people who shared my blood, I continued. Watched them brag about promotions and fiancés and baby showers. And never once did anyone ask me, how did you survive? Never once did they say, tell me what it cost you to come home. I looked up, right at the front row. At my parents. At Emily. They didn't flinch. Because they knew now. I used to think maybe it was my fault, I said. Maybe I'd made myself too hard. Too distant. Maybe I didn't deserve a frame on the wall. But I know now. I was left out not because I wasn't brave enough, but because no one wanted to feel small standing next to someone who survived things they couldn't even name. There were no cameras. No teleprompters. Just me and the mic. And for the first time the mic was mine. Not to defend, not to justify, to witness. I didn't come here to be honored, I said. I came here to say something for every woman who's ever been erased. Who's ever done the work and carried the weight and swallowed the grief so no one else had to. If that's you, if you've ever wondered whether your story is worth telling. I looked out at the women in the audience, young and old in uniform, and out some with babies on their laps, others with folded arms and guarded eyes. It is. We don't all wear medals. We don't all get our names read from a stage. But we remember. We remember the hours, the fear, the grit. We remember each other. Even when the world doesn't face us. And that's enough to break the silence. Someone sniffled softly in the back. Someone else whispered, "Thank you." And for once I let it land. Not as proof I was right, but as proof I wasn't alone. You don't have to shout to lead, I said. You don't have to win medals to be brave. You just have to keep showing up when no one claps, when no one listens, when it feels like your life only exists in the shadows. I placed the coil of bomb wire gently beside the mic. This came from a mission they tried to bury. From a war no one wanted to explain. I tapped the mic once, lightly, but I'm still here. And as long as I am stories won't stay buried. The applause wasn't thunderous, it was warm, sustained, real. The kind that said, "We heard you." The kind that didn't need confetti to matter. When I stepped off the stage, a woman in her 60s approached me. Civilian. Gray hair and a braid. Worn denim jacket. She held out her hand. "I never served," she said, "but I raised 2 kids alone, worked 3 jobs, and sometimes I wondered if anyone would ever see me." She smiled. "You just did." I gripped her hand back. "You've always mattered," I said. "You don't need permission to tell your story." That night, I walked home alone beneath a quiet sky. No press, no escort, just stars. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a ghost walking through a world that forgot me. I felt like a voice. Clear. Steady. And finally heard. I didn't wear the uniform. Not today. Not because I no longer honored it, but because I finally understood something deeper. I never needed the stripes on my shoulder to prove I carried weight. I just needed to stand where once I had been erased and stay. The room wasn't grand. Just a converted wing of a military training academy in Virginia, stripped of ceremony but saturated with presence. They called it the Echo Room now. A name that once lived in shadows, now etched in metal above the doorway. Storm Echo Tactical Leadership Program. In honor of C. Monroe and the unnamed 6. For the first time, Echo didn't mean forgotten. It meant amplified. The seats were filled with young recruits, women in crisp cadet grays, boots scuffed just enough to prove they'd started training, but eyes still wide enough to hold questions the world hadn't answered for them yet. They were the kind of women I once dreamed of meeting but never believed I'd be allowed to lead. Now they sat waiting for a story they didn't know had been lived in silence. Emily opened the ceremony. She stood straighter than she used to, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she now carried something larger than protocol. Conviction. My sister never disappeared. She said she was simply asked to be quiet over and over until we no longer noticed her absence. But absence doesn't mean failure. Silence doesn't mean consent. And being written out of history doesn't make you less a part of it. She stepped aside, voice calm, eyes glistening, and now she gets to finish the sentence herself. I walked up slowly. No fanfare, no applause yet, just eyes. And ears. Willing to listen. I looked around and felt it, not pity, not admiration, but readiness. These women weren't here for a motivational speech. They came for truth. I was once told that the strongest leaders don't always shout, I began. And that's true. But what they didn't say is that silence can be a wound too. I was invisible for years. Not because I wasn't brave, not because I didn't serve, but because what I did didn't fit the frame people were comfortable looking at. They didn't want a story that was raw, or female, or complicated. So they left it out. I've carried that silence for most of my adult life. I carried it through war zones, under enemy fire, and worse, back home, across dinner tables where no one asked what I'd seen. A woman in the second row touched her chest like she was holding something in. I kept going. But silence isn't the enemy. It's what happens when no one listens. And today you're here, you're listening. That changes everything. I turned toward the projection screen behind me. It displayed a single image, not me, not my team, not medals or maps. Just 6 silhouettes. Uncaptioned, faceless. And beneath it, this is where the story begins again. You see, I said the real mission was never just surviving the war. It was surviving the forgetting. Now, we reclaim it. They gave me a plaque after the ceremony. A small one. Simple. Carved from wood recovered from the barracks we trained in before Storm Echo. Nothing flashy. It read C. Monroe. Command. Witness. Voice. I held it for a moment longer than I expected to. Not because it made me feel honored, but because for the first time it felt like something I could pass on. Afterwards, people lingered. Not to congratulate me. To ask questions. To share their own silences. One woman, black hair pulled into a tight bun, barely older than Emily, touched my arm and said, "You made me realize I'm not crazy for wanting to be more than a name on a roster." Another, older, whispered, My daughter's in basic now. I never told her what I went through because I didn't think it would matter. But maybe it's time, maybe it is, maybe it always was. That night, I stood in front of the mirror at my motel. No uniform, no makeup. Just me. The same me who once doubted whether I had the right to speak. To be heard, to be real. Now I saw someone whole not because her pain was gone, but because she stopped hiding it. And before I turned off the light, I wrote one final sentence in my journal, the same one I used to carry folded under a false floorboard in the Middle East. Hồi phục không phải lúc nào cũng là chữa lành, đôi khi là được thấy rõ trình. Min. Healing isn't always about being fixed. Sometimes it's just being seen clearly. So if you're reading this, if you've ever been underestimated, erased, or made to believe your story isn't worth telling, this last part is for you. Don't walk away quiet, tell it. Even if your voice shakes. Because somewhere out there, someone is waiting to hear it.